Welcome to another episode of the EvilTester show, and in this episode we're going to cover the concept of test entities which are usually used for derivation and possibly for planning, possibly for tracking, and those test entities are test conditions, test scenarios, test cases, and test scripts. And before you all run off screaming, I just want to make clear that you do not have to use these for testing. I do not use these for testing. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the logical concepts, what they actually mean, how we can test without them, and what happens when you do test with them. This video will not help you pass your testing certification, but this video may help you become a better and more effective tester. When I started in testing, I took it for granted that professional testing involved using all of these entities. We would create test conditions, we would cross-reference them to requirements, we would combine those test conditions into scenarios, we would take those scenarios and convert them into test cases. From those test cases we would build scripts, then we would push those scripts into suites, then we would track the execution of our testing against those suites of scripts. Everything that we did was ultimately controlled by either a test case or a script. You couldn't raise a defect unless there was a test case to go along with it. That was what professional testing did, and that was why professional testing took so long, took so much maintenance, has eventually been phased out, hopefully, where companies now look at this type of process and think, well, we're not doing that. Let's just automate the entire process. If we can take our tests and push all our testing concepts down on the concept of a test script, we can automate that. Test script is pretty much the same as program code. We could just automate all of this. If the only value that we get from testing is following scripts, then we could automate that. That is ultimately what this process led to, and it's not helpful. But the concepts that are behind test conditions, test scenarios, test cases, and test scripts, they might still be useful to us. When I'm doing testing, I basically have two concepts: test idea, test log. That's pretty much it. Everything else wraps around that. Because I started with these entities, I have some of the logical concepts that underpin those, and they feed into, without me actually using the words test cases, test scripts, into my testing. When I started, we really had no choice. We, as testers, were not in control of our testing. Our testing was pretty much controlled by the tooling that we used, and these concepts were heavily in those tools. If you go online now and you do a search for what is the best test case template, you're going to see every test case must have an ID, every test case must have a name, every test case must have a date it's created. Why would it have these things? I would have these things because tools generate these things automatically, and they're useful for putting in a database. They're not useful for me as a tester. They're completely not useful for me as a tester because we end up communicating saying, yeah, I'm working on test case 327. Doesn't communicate anything to anybody. But a database, that's fine. A tool knows what we're accessing. A tool can use that number and cross-reference. Tools love cross-references. Managers love things in databases because then you can have a tick box that says done, not done, worked, didn't work, and we can report progress based on whatever we're working with in these tools. But we do not want our testing process to be driven by the tool. That's the worst thing you can have. Tool-driven testing is the worst type of testing process imaginable. And yet, test cases, test scripts come out of that world. And very often, people are unknowingly creating test processes which are based on bigger tools by codifying these in spreadsheets, big spreadsheets filled with unmaintainable test cases and test scripts, but we'll come on to that in a second. In the olden days, some tools were so advanced that you would feed in the requirement documents, which were written in MS Word or something, and you could highlight paragraphs in those documents and say, right, I want that to become a test condition. We want this to be a test condition, and it would maintain the cross-references back to those documents. If those documents ever changed, you would upload them. It would try and work out what the changes were. Huge amount of maintenance, all in the name of an effective, well-tracked process so we didn't miss anything. But that tight coupling between the tools and the physical artifacts we were creating meant everything was massively time-consuming and impossible to maintain. One of the issues with test cases and test scripts and test conditions and test scenarios is that they're essentially a model of the system. But they're a bad model of the system because they're essentially a list. Test case 1, test case 2, test case 3. Systems you would never model a system like that. So tools would then have the capability of being able to put them into hierarchies, logical hierarchies, to organize these things, which is a better way of modeling the system. But fundamentally, bear in mind, when we're creating test conditions, test scenarios, test cases, test scripts, and particularly test scenarios, test cases, and test scripts, we're modeling this system, right? I've covered this in previous videos and podcasts. We model the system and then use that model for testing. So one of the values, if there's any value in this, is that we're modeling the system. We're not modeling it well. We're definitely not modeling it well. We're not modeling it in a way that allows us to explore the system on an ongoing basis, that allows us to remodel and change the model going on. But it's a model of the system. So bear that in mind, because that's not often covered when people are talking about why we do test cases and test scripts. One reason that it's done is to model the system and use that model as a basis to help us test. It shouldn't necessarily drive our testing, it shouldn't dictate our testing, but we should use it as a basis for our testing. Now, one of the reasons I'm covering this in a video and a podcast is because people continue to make videos on what is the best template for a test case, what is the best template for a test script, thereby making these as physical concepts that people should use in their testing. The reality is they're logical concepts. Okay, so let's concentrate on these as logical concepts. I think it's a very useful process to go through to logically model what your test process is, what concepts you have, what words you use, why they are important in your process, how you're going to use them, what they remind you of. That is a particularly useful thing to do. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to physically codify them in a tool or your spreadsheets or your tracking, but the exploration will help you. So let's explore these as logical concepts. Let's assume there's some value in them from a logical perspective. Right, so a test condition is something that I'm going to use as a basis for my testing. It often maps onto either an input, username must be 10 characters in length, or username must not be greater than 10 characters. A process, we must be able to log into the system. The user must be able to rename their account name. Maps onto an output. When the user types in a username that's incorrect, they receive an error message of this format. Or it might say of this format, where we then, when we're testing, have to check that it's that exact format. Or it might just say they receive an error message, in which case we know we have to explore error messages. Test conditions, as taught from a tooling perspective, are usually derived from an external model. They usually map onto requirements or some regulation. They don't have to. We can come up with test conditions based on risk, based on things that we've heard in passing, based on what the competitors do, based on what tools of this type normally do. We don't have to restrict our testing to external model derived conditions, but that's really where test conditions came from, the deriving it from an external model, the tracking it back to something else so that we could justify our testing. Because a lot of this, remember, is testing is an unbounded activity. We could do millions of tests by typing into a username field because we could do every single combination of characters, but they're not important. So we have to try and figure out how to bound this, how to restrict our testing, try and work out what is important. And a lot of this was a way of trying to work out what was important and to justify it by a call to authority. Nowadays, I think of these as test ideas. Before I start testing, I'll come up with a set of test ideas. I may have a set of test ideas somewhere that I pull into a particular test session, into a test log, where I say, this is what I'm going to cover in this particular test session of half an hour, 2 hours, or this is what I'm going to work on next. So they're test ideas, and I use them as a basis to explore from there. So what is a test scenario? Well, a test scenario is the next evolution of a test condition. Very often what we see is that test conditions, test scenarios, test cases, test scripts are really just logical evolutions in a derivation process, where they get more and more detailed over time. So a test scenario is very often a collection of test conditions. Test condition, they're kind of disparate in the requirements. So we find something that relates to the input. We find something that relates to the process of inputting that. Find something that relates to the output. So then we now have a test scenario that groups all those together. So it's a collection of test conditions. It's really a process type identification. The next step then in that logical expansion would be a test case, where a test case is taking a test scenario. What are the specific inputs that we would put into that test case? What is the specific way we would implement that process? What are the specific set of expected results? Now with a test case, they're getting very, very specific. One of the things I've noticed now is that people combine the concept of a test case with a test script. So you get a very specific thing that you want to cover in your testing, and then a very specific way of implementing that specific thing is very often now called a test case. That in my head is not how I think about a test case. For me, a test case is the specific codification, because we're trying to restrict the scope of our testing. What are the inputs that are important? What are the process? What are the outputs? And where would it necessarily come through? But I don't think now in those concepts, but I have in my head the concept of, well, we have to bound our testing. We have to get very specific. I have to choose specific data. Why is that data important? And I'll write that down in my log, but I will not in advance create test cases which are so locked down. Now here's the very worst concept that we've ever had in software testing, I think. Out of all the bad concepts in software testing, this could be the worst. Test script, where a test script is a set of steps to follow to achieve the outcomes that are listed in the test case. So if a test case says, we have these specific inputs, a test script would say, click on this particular field, type in input X, now click this button, now check that the screen shows error message 12347, which is codified in the test script. So it's a set of steps and a set of interrogations to make that follow. Remember, a test script to this doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why you're doing it. It just says, this is what you do. Don't think anymore. We have issues with this when people are executing their testing on the basis of test scripts, because they spend so much time looking at a test script to make sure that they're doing it right, that they kind of glance up to the screen, but they spend more time down here making sure this is correct than what happens up there. I must type in the letters B-O-B, B-O-B, press the button, looking down here at the test script, but something has actually flashed on screen that I haven't seen. Now check that the error message, the flashing thing has gone away, there's the error message, the test script has passed, but the system is a complete mess, but I'm not noticing it because I'm focused so much on this test script. One of the explanations for a test script are that the complicated thing in testing is figuring out what you're going to test and why. So the doing of it was seen as a kind of unskilled activity, so we could pass that off to other people. We could take people off the streets and give them the test scripts and they would follow them. This is such a bad concept, and it led to massive amounts of outsourcing, hugely costly test processes. But there were a lot of tools that supported this, so it was great for tool vendors. Tools that support this are great for people in testing that don't know what they're doing because they don't have to think through the process, they just do what the tool does. None of this is helpful. I do not need a test script in order to test an application, particularly when I know the application, particularly when I understand how it works. I do not need a test case to test the application. If I've got an idea in my head, I can follow it through and test directly from that. I don't necessarily need a test scenario. All I really need are test ideas. Once I've got test ideas, I can then put them into action. With a test condition, test scenario, test case, test script process, it can take months before you're ready to test. At the point that you're ready to test, after all those months, you start to come in and use the system and discover your test scripts are wrong because the screenshot that you got 3 months ago doesn't match onto the system now. So you now have to spend 2 months changing all that stuff that you wrote, making the testing incredibly inefficient and ineffective. These concepts, when they're put in as physical concepts, make your testing incredibly hard to maintain. Imagine you've looked at a system, you've read the requirements, you've come up with 1,000 test cases, and you've decided, well, I'm not going to do test cases and test scripts. So your test cases have all the steps that you're going to do with all the data that you're going to have in there. If you have to change it, you've repeated that step of enter the username in the field that says username. Or we changed that to say user. You now have to change 1,000 test cases And it's not an easy way to manage your testing. It's not a good way to manage your testing. So if you see really detailed templates, you do not need to do this for testing. Testing does not require these as physical implementations. Now, you might work in a company that does require you to do this in your testing. That's fine if you want a job and this is the only way you're going to get the job and this is what the company does, you'll implement this. But do not think for a second that this is an effective test process, that this is a professional test process. Do not think that this is the best way to do testing. Do not think that you have to fill in a huge template before you can test. You don't. I do most of my testing with test ideas and test logs. So a test condition is a test idea. If I read a requirement document or I see a requirement or I overhear a requirement, that's an idea. That's something I want to test. So what I'll then do is put that into a test session and I'll write down what I'm doing. I create a test log. I don't write scripts because I know how the system works, but I write down what I've done. Right? The log, the execution, what we actually did is more important than a test case up front that says, I think this is how you're going to do this. Test script is a physical representation of the logical process that we want to achieve when we're testing. We don't need test scripts if we know how the system works. But what is important is what I think I'm going to do and why, what I actually did and how, and what I think I still have to do, what questions remain unanswered, what did I learn and observe as I was doing that work that can then feed into the next step in our testing. That test ideas, what I think I'm going to do and why, the test log, what I actually did and how. The test log also contains in it my observations of what I think I still have to do, what are my questions, what are the things that looked a little bit odd. So I tend to work with a test idea and test log. So how then do these concepts help? Well, I mean, I learned them years ago, so they're ingrained in my head, and I had to unlearn how to do testing so that I wasn't overly influenced by this. I think one of the things that helped me unlearn it was working with really bad tools that were so hard to use, that took up so much time, that crashed, that lost data. We needed to simplify in order to be more effective. You would do all this upfront work, then you would get this much time for testing. So you couldn't really use that work in the way that you wanted to, and the tools were slowing you down. So the more I was able to take ownership of the testing, the more we slimmed it down. All right, so how could these concepts help? Knowing that I've unlearned it, what did I retain from those concepts that I still think of when I'm doing my testing? So test conditions are test ideas. I know that in order to test the system, I have to have some ideas of what I'm doing. Something that I'm going to use as a basis for my testing. Now, I might not have any ideas when I start, so I'll look at the system and then I'll get some ideas of what I want to do. I can see there's a name input. I can see there's a button. I can see over here that there's a delete button. So I now have ideas of things that I can cover. The concept of test conditions is a reminder that I can think in advance about what I want to test at a high level. I don't necessarily have to think in detail, but some of the ideas that I have for testing, I may want to think through them in detail because I'm trying to think, well, how can I check that? How can I observe if that has worked? Do I have access to the database in order to do that? Do I have tooling that lets me access the database? So I'm thinking ahead to make sure that I have the capabilities and access to allow me to do the work later on. Test conditions are very often disparate ideas, but it allows me to think in terms of, well, is this related to the input? Is this related to the process? Is this related to the output? Have I got a big enough picture to allow me to start testing this? It's a reminder that I'm working with external models, but that's not exclusively where it comes from. Test ideas can come from the learning that we do, the risks that we think of. They don't have to be cross-referenced to an external requirement document. So test condition is basically the ideas. Test scenarios remind me that, well, sometimes thinking in tiny disparate chunks, like, the username must be less than 10 characters, doesn't help me think about the process. Test scenarios are thinking, well, what specifically actions do people want to achieve? What specific process ideas do I need to make sure that I cover in my testing, and how do I want to explore them? Well, what if, when we're doing this process, the link to the database falls down? The what if scenarios. So test scenarios let me think a broader logical level without having to necessarily make physical architecture diagrams or detailed graphs of the system. I can just think in logical terms about the processes. That's really what a test scenario does for me. So a test case. Test case is really overly specific when it's too detailed, but that specific is important. That specificity. What is specifically important? What data is really important that I want to cover? Where are the specific oracles? How do I know that this result is correct or not? What am I expecting to see here? What oracle is telling me that? What is guiding me? How do I know I'm not just making this up? How do I know I'm not just going back to people and saying, shouldn't do this? Yes, it should. I need to know that. That's what the test case reminds me of. What is the basis that I'm testing from? And test cases also remind me, well, how deep do I want to interrogate at this time? Test case sets out, well, these are the expected results you should have. So that reminds me of, well, do I just want to check this at the UI? Do I want to dive into the database? Do I want to go and look at the files that are generated? Do I want to go and look in the logs? Should I be pushing this further, making sure that the outputs from this particular process feed into this next process? How big is this scenario or test case that I want to cover? This flow that I'm going through, the specifics. That reminder that I need to limit my testing and focus on specifics is quite useful. So the worst concept of them all, the test script. How on earth could test scripts possibly help me in this day and age? Well, there are things that a test script does not do that are important. Do I know how to use the system? Test script doesn't tell me how to use the system. A test script tells me what to do in this particular test script ID that we are currently running. Do I know why the system is used? Test script doesn't tell me why the system is used. It just says, do these things, look for this. But it's important that I know how to use the system, why the system is used, what people use it for, what do they try and achieve, what particular functions do they use, how do they use them most, what data feeds through them. Do I know technically how to interrogate the system, not just look at the UI? Do I know how to administer the system in order to recover for certain situations, to change the underlying data to let me test things? Test scripts don't tell me that, but those are really important. And so it's a reminder that I need to know that in order to not have a test script, in order to not follow a particular set of rules, I need to know why and how this thing works. Then I don't need a list of steps because I know how to achieve the end goals that I'm trying to achieve. Sometimes if a process is particularly complicated and I don't understand it particularly well, if I'm doing something very technical, I may have a set of instructions that I'm using that I keep updated, but it's a template. It's not type in Bob, then click the button. It's in order to do X, type in this command. One of the things that I think is a real danger with the concept of test cases and test scripts is both making a single test script for a test case, because then you're doubling up your work for your test case and test script, and really your test script is saying type in Bob when nothing ever needs to go down to that level of detail. Next thing with a test script is you can make them peers. So you can make a test script a template and it's filled in by the data that's in the test case. That's better because there's less to maintain, but we still probably don't need it because we know how to achieve the results that are listed in the test case. Test script is probably superfluous. But a test script to me is a reminder of, well, if I can specify it in this much detail, if it is important to follow those paths, should I be automating at this point? It's a reminder that we can automate parts of our work, particularly if we can document them in that detail, particularly if it's something we're going to repeat a lot, particularly if it's a set of data that we want to feed through the same process. Perhaps I can automate that. Now, the danger with using the concept of test scripts in the real world is that people immediately think, well, if we're going to write test scripts, we may as well just automate all of this. But if you're not writing test scripts, never forget that we can use tooling, that we can automate parts of our work to achieve our overall coverage goals. If you do write test scripts, if you do go down to that point, make them templates. Make them just enough information to guide you with what you're doing. You do not need to write scripts that have specific data items in there that you follow, so that when you want to have another script with different data, you have to copy and paste the script and put the data in. It must be a data-driven process. One of the things that is never taught with test scripts is that test scripts are a mapping onto the physical world. In a physical world, in your systems, you're really creating a graph of the application, and your test script is a single path through that graph. The path has data elements that must be there in order to take that path, and data elements were optional, which are templated. So a reminder that models can be physically based on your system, and you can use a physical based model for coverage, and you can use a physical based model to check, have I done enough just physical coverage of this, not logical coverage in terms of the conditions, but just physical coverage of, have I hit this screen, have I touched this button, have I filled in this form. It might be important to have that level of coverage, but a test script is not a good model for that. But a graph-based diagram might well be a much better model. So it's a reminder that we don't just have logical models of the system, we do have physical models, even if we're not using them. And a test script is really physical path-based coverage. So I'm not going to give you any templates for test cases or test scripts. If you want those, go onto YouTube, do any search for test cases, the Element Guide to Test Cases and Test Scripts, how to write test cases. You'll see templates. That is not good testing. But if that is what you're forced to do in your work, then that's fine. Just follow the process. What's more important is try and simplify your testing. I simplify it down now to test ideas, test logs. I can pretty much map those back onto the logical entities that I learned when I was starting, but I don't use those. I understand what led to their creation in terms of thinking through the process in different stage. I lived through the days where there were new test tools coming out that codified this, so I know how painful it can be. Nowadays, people use test cases and test scripts without any tool support and still carry forward old concepts like IDs, dates. They don't know how to model their test process. The most important thing is to learn how to model your test process and take control over it. Sadly, so many of us work in environments where we don't have that control. So live with it, deal with it, but do not think that because you're creating test conditions and test scenarios and test cases and test scripts and you're cross-referencing them all, that you are doing good testing. You are doing slow, heavily documented, hard to maintain testing. You can do testing differently. Okay, so I've covered the basic concepts. If you answer any ISTQB test certification questions with the answers and concepts I've given you, you will probably fail. This is about how do we effectively test applications. We don't need to have a big formal process. We can work with test ideas. We can come up with test ideas that we have created and identified in our head. The test ideas do not need to be derived back to some sort of formal test basis. We can simplify this. Build your own logical models of testing so you understand. Think through when you're using this, is this helping me? Do I need this level of detail? How can I simplify this? If you work in an environment that forces you to do this, how can I simplify my work to meet the constraints that they've put in, but still make it more effective for me? Try and take more ownership of your test process. So I don't see a lot of value in these entities anymore. I still find some value in the concepts that underpin them. Thank you very much for sticking around this long. You can get much more information at eviltester.com. See you in the next video. Thanks very much. Bye.